Good morning. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be part of your annual meeting today, but it's my sincere hope that this message will be of interest to you and will be useful to the work of your association. My old range professor, Dr. Bailey at the University of Alberta, used to say that range management was both art and science, and I think that recognizes the role of the rancher, the producer on the land, as well as the contributions that science can make. When we look back over the past century, we see the leadership in the ranching community guiding not only practices, but policies and rangeland research as well. So I'd like to tell you a series of stories, starting about 1881 and eventually bringing us up to the present day, to explore some of those connections between ranching, policy, and research. My central question to you this morning is, early rangeland lessons. Are 100-year-old learning still relevant today? So the first piece of wisdom that I'd like to share is that of a Piikani elder, Wilfred Yellowwing. He's about 85 years old and has spent his entire life working out on the land, beginning as a ranch cowboy on the Band Ranch when he was about 14 years old. And when Wilfred talks to his own people about grazing management, he always reminds them that grazing was not constant on the landscape. He says that after there was grazing, there was rest. And there's a wonderful illustration that we can look to on the Piikani Reserve. Over thousands of years, bison migrated between plains and the parkland and foothills landscapes, driven by cycles of season, of drought, predators, and the influence of indigenous people, including their use of fire. These rocks on the Piikani Reserve near Brockett are part of the boulder train, just like the big rock at Okotoks. And this, when you examine these rocks, which sit in perfect funnels settled down into the landscape, you can see that they've been rubbed on by bison over probably about 12,000 years. And over that time period, as the bison came and went in their migration, and as they removed the soil from around the boulders, the winds carried that soil away, and then eventually the rocks actually settled down in the landscape. And so Wilfred would point to these as an example of how the bison migrated. And the graphic there in the lower right shows that migration from the Central Plains in spring and summer back to the foothills and parkland in the fall and winter. And so these are markers of that annual migration, so that after there was grazing, there was rest. What I'd like to do next is I'd like to contrast the development of domestic livestock grazing on rangeland, first in the United States, and then I'll tell you how it unfolded in Canada. And we can see where the roots of range management first took root. The rangelands of the western U.S. were used as free range for many decades, with the public domain not coming under any regulatory control until 1898. And that's actually later than what happened here in Canada. The growth of the cattle industry in the northern and central Great Plains began in the early 1870s. Most of the cattle used for the base herds in the plains area came from Texas. By the mid-1880s, cattle had reached peak numbers on most western ranges, and range exploitation was at a maximum, followed by some dramatic losses in livestock due to drought, bad winters, and starvation. Also, there was considerable conflict between cattlemen and sheepmen in the 1890s and the early 1900s. The sheepmen were mobile, the cattlemen were not. So, rangelands could be double grazed and badly damaged. Part of this demand was driven by the scarcity of farmland, resulting in a shift in focus to livestock production. Federal lands became grazing commons, if you will. Between 1880 and 1910, there was a great reduction in the rangeland resource, and this reduction was caused by overgrazing and conversion of rangeland to farmland. At this point, the poor management of the nation's rangelands started to become an issue. Much further down the road, the Taylor Grazing Act would eventually come into force, but that's jumping ahead. And this is these are just some statistics that were captured during the Great Dust Bowl, but it shows that all the way through this time period, the American rangeland landscape is in quite serious decline. So what I'd like to tell you now, share with you, is a story that I heard back in 1998 that kind of chronicles the development of range management in the United States and had an influence in our part of the world as well. Sadly, the story was never published, but I've tried to kind of piece it back together. So, as the Western rangelands cratered, those trends were being noticed, and we started to see a response in the science world. Enter the University of Nebraska. University of Nebraska Lincoln has a long history of being a leader in the study of rangeland and prairie ecology and management. A number of pioneers in rangeland ecology were educated and conducted research at the U of N. And a very, very important feature was this early botanical seminar called the Bessie Seminar, was concerned with the economic implications of botany, concerned with the everyday problems of the Nebraska farmer and rancher. And Dr. Bessie, he was actually besieged by questions from people on the land. So we learned that Bessie's priority with his students was influenced by what was happening out on the land and by the people who looked to him for some guidance. And so we can see that farmers and ranchers had a role in formulating what we would call some of the first research questions. Two really big names from the UNB as students and then as professors were Clements and Weaver. They were pioneers advancing basic ecological concepts, plant species response to grazing and disturbance, theories of plant community succession. And of course, every student of range management should recognize Clements' grazing response graphic on the lower left, showing increasers, decreasers, and invaders. So this was information that was defined in the first decade of the last century. John Weaver produced the first graphic showing the effect of grazing impact on native grass roots. And there's Dr. Weaver having a very close-up look down in a very deep excavation, looking at the nature of rangeland rooting patterns. Then we come to Arthur W. Sampson. Arthur Sampson is really one of my heroes. He was considered the father of range management, and as a student, he was a very strong athlete. He would make when he was studying or working on his master's in Oregon, he would make a daily trek up a local highland to replace the weather charts for the university weather station. And furthermore, he was a boxer. He was known as the Utah Kid. In 1910, he conducted the first grazing system experiments in Oregon, developed the concept of spring deferral, or providing early rest before grazing would start, and he was the first to formulate the basic principles of range management. And you can still find this book in just about any university library, Sampson's Principles of Range Management textbook. And so the principles that we use today have basically come down from Arthur Sampson. Balance grazing demand with the forage supply, consider season of grazing, distribute livestock grazing pressure on the landscape. His fourth principle originally was match kind and class of livestock. We've kind of rolled that up into our principle one, and then we've added another one, effective rest after grazing. Nonetheless, we see these early principles still at work today. And of course, as I work towards part two of this presentation, I will do a wrap-up, walking us back through those principles and kind of share our perspective on how we would apply them today. Okay, so that's the U.S. picture. Let's look at the Canadian scene. So first of all, we have some eyewitnesses to consider. One of the first sort of science projects was sponsored by the Dominion of Canada, was for John Palliser to have a look at the dry zone of the Central Plains. And what Palliser saw when he came through, I guess it was actually 1858, he saw a desert, and he suggested that development would be very limited, potential was very limited in this dry, arid region. But by the time the bison were gone and with perhaps a couple decades of favorable moisture, John McCown, another scientist or botanist, came through in the 1880s, and he saw a different picture. He saw a garden. By 1879, the bison were essentially extirpated from the Canadian prairie. And at this point, the Dominion of Canada established, through order in council, established grazing leases. These were established for a period of 3 years. The policy was really aimed to attract risk capital to an underdeveloped area. The leases were granted for up to 21 years, and it required stocking up to capacity within that 3-year period. The policy also established a blanket stocking rate value to ensure that the leases were utilized. Here in Canada, the Dominion grazing lease policy of the day magnified the pressures of climate and settlement on rangelands. And we're seeing pressures somewhat similar to what we've seen in the United States. But here's the rub. The policy required a stocking rate that was set at 10 acres per head per year. So if we consider that some of our most productive foothill ranges might be sustainably stocked at 20 to 24 acres per head per year, we can see that we're going to have trouble trying to meet that goal. So grazing lease policy didn't address differences in the productivity of the land, and since grazing lease taxation and rental rates were not based on the reasonable economic returns of ranching, therefore there were compelling economic pressures to overgraze. And the inequities of the system were felt most strongly in the semi-arid southeast, where range pasture productivity might be 20% of what it would be, say, in the foothills region. So, enter local ranchers. With the leadership of people like George Ross Sr., a young George Ross in this picture, in an organization that was named the Shortgrass Stock Growers Association, which I believe was later amalgamated with the Western Stock Growers. George and his community began to raise questions to their elected officials about the state of the range. So the ranching community played a pivotal role in the development of rangeland research, which was so desperately needed to guide the grazing practices of the ranching industry. And the shortgrass stock growers appeared to be one of the first forums to promote the new and evolving concept of range management. And they provided an early definition of carrying capacity, where they said the committee defined carrying capacity as the number of cattle which could be grazed in good commercial condition upon the range and preserve the grass with a reasonable carryover from year to year. So you can see there's already a real strong understanding of some of the basics. And I'm going to refer to this trend line several times during the presentation. I had created this a number of years ago as part of the Sage Grouse Recovery Plan, just to illustrate to colleagues that were working in the planning of how stocking rates had evolved in the dry rangelands south of Medicine Hat. So the red line is kind of the government recommended rate, and then as we get towards the right-hand side of the graph, we see some actual stocking rate values that have been brought in from grazing leases. But as the line rises, that means we're using more acres to carry an animal for an animal unit year. So our starting point is 1881 with the compulsory 10 acre per head per year rate. 8 years later, the ranching community are already starting to get representation about the problem with this compulsory rate. We see extreme pressure still coming to bear during this period of homesteading, that's about 1905 when Alberta becomes a province. And then we see overgrazing really coming to a head in the time of the Dust Bowl. And for those of you that would like to see it portrayed as acres per AUM, basically the range was being stocked to try to harvest at a rate of about 1.2 AUMs per acre, which clearly was going to be devastating in that dry mixed grass environment. So we see the 10 acre rate, we see the adjustment to 20, we see further adjustments taking place as we work through that time period. Okay, so what happened? The first research became established at Manyberries. The Dominion Experimental Farm Service was established at 1-4 near Manyberries. The quote is, "The first station was established at the request of the stockmen in 1927 by the Dominion Department of Agriculture in cooperation with the Gilchrist Brothers of Wildhorse. The research program provided the first scientifically based guidelines on stocking rates and range management practices in the country." And it's really important to acknowledge the Gilchrist brothers. These were the fellows that really made it happen. Over on the right is Brother Reuben. He was the fellow that was involved in politics, and he made representation to the federal government. Far left and center, the tall gentlemen are Brother Joe and Brother Chester, and they were the ones that put up the first land. They contributed a significant chunk of land from their grazing leases that would allow the 1-4 experimental farm to be established. So a very, very important contribution. I've forgotten the name of the brother there in the lower middle, but he was involved in conservation as well. Studies began immediately as there was a sense of urgency provided by the ranching community. The upper right is an example of just how heavily grazed things were by the late 1920 time period. Lower left, early studies show these plant communities are dominated by blue grama, and those gentlemen are mapping the actual vegetation there in that example. And the lower right is really our first rangeland scientist, Dr. Clark. And he with Dr. Tisdale were the first ones to really describe the plant communities. And they described them as the shortgrass prairie. And we'll revisit that definition here in a bit. 1-4 is no longer operated by the federal government, but the province has maintained it as a research ranch with grazing management provided by a local grazing association. But over the years, many, many important research findings were developed at 1-4, evaluation of sustainable stocking rates, grazing systems, impacts of drought, basic plant ecology studies, livestock production, regrassing strategies, and a long list of other topics. And through this time period, of course, the ranching community was working. They were watching the studies. They were engaged in the findings that were coming out of the work at 1-4. And in an attempt to address the issues that they had struggled with over the past decades, concerned ranchers in the shortgrass stock growers came together at their annual meeting in 1938, and they produced the following resolution. And they said, whereas the cost of grass to leaseholders as charged by the provincial government in rent and taxes heretofore has not been based on the productivity values of various range areas. Therefore, be it resolved that with a view to rating land according to its earning capacity in relation to livestock values based upon investigations and surveys already conducted in the shortgrass area. So the ranchers, they were engaged as the research was being conducted, and they immediately took those findings back to the provincial government. Since 1930, the Alberta's natural resources are now being managed by the province. They bring that back to their legislators in their home province. And what this led to was a change in policy. So by 1945, the province of Alberta implements grazing lease policy that bases rental and tax rates on carrying capacity and the sale value of livestock. By 1947, we see the research is ongoing and a further refinement of the recommended stocking rate to 50 acres per head. This is becoming established as one of the first key principles of range management, to balance supply with demand. Okay, In part two, I'm going to carry on from that where we left off, basically the time of the end of the Second World War. Major policy changes had taken place. We're going to look at a couple of key principles, how relevant they are today, and then I'm going to wrap up by walking you through the 4 principles of range management and try to tie it all together. So in the second part, we reflect on what's happened, what's changed. Practice knowledge has grown, policies have changed, and things are evolving. We can reflect on the words of Alfred Ernest Cross, associated with the A7 Ranch and a pioneer rancher in the foothills of Alberta. And Cross said, if you take care of the grass, it'll take care of you. So what happened in this time period after the policy changes? So we really see the implementation of the first policy to balance supply, forage supply with the demand for grazing, balancing the health of the land with livestock production. Recognition by ranchers of the need to manage within sustainable limits is having an impact on the health of the land. There's an emergence of rangeland science, including education and research, development of range management principles and practices further, and we see both policy and practices are now supporting rangeland recovery. The early observers of the range, Clark and Tisdale, in the first research that they reported, they described the prairie, this dry prairie region that we're thinking about south of Medicine Hat, they described it as shortgrass prairie. But by 1950, Bob Copeland from the University of Saskatchewan started to examine this area of prairie. Incidentally, Copeland was a student of Weaver, so there's our connection back to Nebraska. And through his studies, he felt that, and the paper that he published in 1950, he renamed this area from shortgrass to mixed grass. And that was because of the emergence of the recovery and the emergence of tall midgrasses like needle and thread, wheatgrasses, and things like western porcupine grass. So this graphic shows us kind of the phases of evolving management in the area, once again, of the dry mixed grass prairie south of Medicine Hat. And again, the red line is the Government of Canada or the Government of Alberta's recommended stocking rate of the day from 1881 to roughly present day. And I've already kind of described the early events. The range degradation problems in those early decades of the century came to a head in the Dust Bowl. And then Dust Bowl drought began to intensify starting in 1928. The years following were very dry. Ranges were overstocked as farmers and ranchers struggled to survive. And then as livestock numbers peaked in the 1930s, stocking rates were decreased to 30 acres per head, and then again to 50 acres per head per animal unit year. These changes were driven by Ag Canada's work, and later this was with the ongoing dialogue of ranchers with provincial grazing lease staff. So range management principles and practice are becoming well-rooted. Concepts like monitoring range condition, the value of carryover and litter, the importance of water development for animal distribution, cross-fencing to facilitate rotational grazing, all of these factors have evolved and contributed to healthy rangelands. Looking back on the U.S. side of the border, we can see the statistics, the reporting on the federal rangelands are starting to show improvement as well. We can see that a significant portion of their rangelands are starting to improve. Okay, let's reflect on some more learnings and wisdom. And I'd like to draw an old stockman saying that comes from the writings of Bob Ross. And Bob Ross was a well-beloved rangeland conservationist from the state of Montana. And he published a book called Rangeland Tips, and he had a bunch of these, but that's where this is from. The old stockman said, if you keep down the shoot, you kill the root. And we have Dr. Weaver coming back as well and speaking to us, and he says, pay attention to the roots. He's encouraging us to look below the surface and to look at the functional aspects of rangeland. And it's for this reason that we developed the Rangeland Health Tools starting just about 20 years ago to look beyond just forage production, but to actually look at the ecological processes that go on healthy rangeland. And rangeland health helps us to understand if our rangelands are under pressure or showing signs of degradation. Well, one of those important connections is the importance of carbon capture. Our old stockman and Dr. Weaver, we might see them kind of as prophets of the future. Today we're learning about the significance of the rangeland connection to climate. About 9 years ago, I led a group that put together a technical seed document for Alberta Climate Change Central to look at one link, which was between rangelands and the storage of soil organic carbon. Large amounts of organic carbon are present in Alberta rangelands. And 1 hectare of rangeland may contain between 50 and 200 tons of carbon in the soil organic matter. This kind of gives us kind of an overview of, if we look at the dry mixed grass prairie, we might have about 47 tons per hectare. If we go to the dark brown soil zone or the mixed grass, about 76 tons per hectare. Foothills fescue, something on the order of 150, and in a mixed wood boreal forest setting, say 102 to 130 tons per hectare. So it's kind of intriguing to see that we have certain grassland types that may actually store more soil organic carbon than some forested communities. And of course, we've also learned that through the disturbance of our rangeland soils, cultivation for crop production, on average, we will lose about 30% of that stored carbon to the atmosphere. An important study that was carried out at Stavely, and of course, just a reminder that Stavely was also established at the recommendation of the industry. 1948, the Western Stock Growers recommended the establishment of a research facility over in the foothill region to complement what was happening at 1-4. In this famous stocking rate study that Alex Johnson did, he compared stocking levels over a period of 45 years. And we see that in the very heavily grazed treatment, which was deliberately heavily stocked for that time period, we can actually see that grazing can reduce the input of the root system to the soil, and we also will be losing soil organic carbon through erosion of water by water and wind. We see the soil column maintained in the upper photo, and we see the degraded profile in the lower right photo. And of course, there are various strategies that are being considered to enhance the storage and capture of soil organic carbon. And of course, probably one of the most effective ones of those is to convert marginal cropland back to some kind of perennial cover, kind of resembling rangeland. We also, the ongoing stewardship of rangeland soils in the maintenance of those carbon stocks is also very important. Back to the old stockman again. The old stockman said, "It takes grass to make grass." Again, from Bob Ross, State of Montana Rangeland Tips. I think one of the most important experiences that I had in my career working as a rangeland specialist in the grassland part of the province was the drought that took place between 1999 and 2001. And we see these are long-term records that were put together by Alberta Agriculture, showing the long-term average there in the red line. And then as we entered the drought period, this 3-year drought period, we can see that the moisture level dropped very, very significantly. It was probably 35% of normal, something on that range. And the area that I'm kind of describing to you in this part of the presentation is this area around Medicine Hat, where we've got about 2.5 million acres of native rangeland. And then if we look at just over there, just to the west of the British block there, the top of the circle there, Over on the west side of that block, we have a place called, of all names, Rainy Hills. And we can see from the forage production data there with the blue line, we can see that forage production has basically cratered during this 3-year time period. And also the red line is showing us that our litter reserves, our litter levels, are cratering as well. And so a drought like this, which probably in this area was probably actually more severe than the drought, any of the drought that we experienced during the Dust Bowl, these drought impacts can be major, reducing plant vigor, reducing herbage yield, reducing that insulating litter level, and reducing root growth. And this can have a cumulative and long-term effect. And this effect can be very long-term, especially when range is degraded. We expect a short recovery process if ranges are healthy, like the ones on the left, and a longer-term recovery, like the one on the right. And of course, I think one of the very, very important contributions to range science that Agriculture Canada contributed was our understanding of the importance of litter. And of course, litter is built right into our range health assessment. Litter serves to cool the soil surface, enhance water infiltration, retain scarce moisture. And in the dry mixed grass prairie, just removing litter can, even in an average moisture year, will reduce our forage yields by about 50%. In the more moist foothill region, lack of litter may affect about 30% of the yield during dry years. So really, really a critical piece of underpinning our stability of productivity on our rangelands. Walter Wilms put together this little graphic. He was one of the scientists that led this litter study, and it kind of illustrates this importance of litter. It takes grass to make grass. The part that very much impressed me was the response of the industry, getting right on top of it, extended feeding, deep culling, early marketing of calves, livestock moved out of Alberta, whole herd liquidation, and then a bunch of range management practice changes, delayed turnouts, early roundup, grazing for the breeding period only, reduced stocking levels, livestock water programs, and a complete destocking of pastures. And then what was really interesting, in 2002, when we actually had significant moisture and recovery of the moisture supply, we still had probably a quarter of the rangeland in that area that I showed you previously in the red circle that remained ungrazed during 2002 to allow it to recover. And one of my colleagues who's now retired from public service, Bruce Cairns, did a simple little clipping study where he looked at a fence line contrast, and same soil type, different grazing history, and he went in and he did some clipping, and he demonstrated the productivity in that first recovery year after the drought broke. And you can see that on the unhealthy side, only 800 pounds per acre of grass was produced, and there was just a paltry 30 pounds per acre of litter. On the healthy side, 2,600 pounds of forage was produced, and there was an abundant 1,500 pounds per acre of litter. So just a simple illustration of the resilience that rangeland can have when we maintain rangeland health. So in this last portion of my talk, I'm just going to very quickly just walk you back through the basic principles of range management. And I asked the rhetorical question, are they relevant today? But of course, I strongly believe that they are. So let's just walk through them very quickly. Of course, the first and most important principle is to balance livestock needs with the available forage supply. We have to recognize that livestock, we harvest forage to produce red meat, but we also need to maintain residue to protect the needs of other critters on the range and to maintain our soil function as well. We've learned the very important value of rangeland litter, which I've just reviewed. That's very important in stabilizing productivity and protecting soils. One of the important adjustments, of course, that we've had to make in recent years is to consider cow size on rangeland. A stocking rate that may have worked 40 years ago may need to be substantially adjusted, especially if we're grazing larger animals need more forage, and we have to adjust. And also in this age where we're starting to reflect on the health and function of riparian areas, residue is also important in stream banks to capture and turn bad mud into good mud as we restabilize those banks. And just a graphic illustration of same soil type, different grazing history, different levels of range health, and getting our forage utilization in balance and maintaining health through time. Our second principle, of course, is to minimize the negative effects of spring grazing. That's kind of traditionally how we approach that, and that was primarily considering the energy balance in the plant and giving the plant an opportunity to recover from the stresses of early leaf growth, to give it a chance to recover root reserves before the range is ready to graze. But we also, especially when we start talking about riparian grazing, there are other times where we need to avoid grazing during vulnerable periods. So it might not just be the spring period. Dr. Wilms, of course, our litter advocate, he feels that that early spring use may not only affect that carbon balance in plants, but it may also be influencing litter reserves and moisture retention. In our riparian areas where we're trying to reestablish woody species, these woody plants may in fact be very attractive in late summer and fall, and in an early period of recovery in a riparian area, protection during late summer and fall may in fact need to be an important management priority. And of course, we can also complementary grazing using tame forages to alleviate the stress of that early spring grazing period can also be very, very powerful in enhancing productivity on the native range by using seeded forages during that spring period. Of course, the third principle, to distribute livestock evenly, we see in this graphic example the ranchers using a number of things to distribute livestock pressure, fence design, water supply, salt and supplement placement, and perhaps riding and placing livestock. We've had some research done at Miles City that has really given us an improved understanding of animal distribution. These old examples that illustrate hill climbers versus valley dwellers. So we have to try to figure out how to deal with the valley dweller to try to get that spreading of grazing over the landscape to a practical level. Monitoring grazing patterns in our fields is important, especially to mitigate heavily impacted areas. And off-stream water has been a very useful tool to not only move livestock around on large rangeland units, but also to pull them away from riparian areas. And I guess one of the other things is that not all patchiness in our grazing patterns is necessarily bad, and often in some of our habitat integration exercises, patchy grazing can be quite helpful to the bird species that occupy and have evolved with our rangeland landscapes. So that takes us down to our last principle, and that is to provide effective rest after grazing. We need to provide rest to plants at a time when moisture and growing conditions are suitable for them to recover from the stresses of grazing. And of course, through the years that I've worked with ranchers in many portions of the province, deferred rotation grazing, such as this example, is really a very powerful tool to mitigate the impacts of spring grazing, but also to provide effective rest after grazing as well. And a really interesting little project that was done in the Stony Hills area, south slope of the Cypress Hills, was taking a field where a creek had been very heavily impacted, simply splitting it, putting in a two-field switchback, grazing one side early one year, followed by rotating to the other field later on in the season, and then switching that pattern the next season. That simple, very simple rotational grazing example produced this kind of recovery that we see on the right-hand side there. Again, the Stony Hills Grazing Association, and a project that, again, Bruce Cairns and Don McLennan worked on together. So, as we wrap up, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And of course, I think that in our modern age, it's very important for us to start off by defining our management objectives. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And I think range health assessment and riparian health assessment as well can help us to really focus what it is we need to achieve so that we can match practices with the needs of the resource. And then we put principles into practice. Every farm or ranch unit is unique, and we have a whole shopping list of things that we can apply to implement those 4 principles of range management that were first crafted by Arthur Sampson way back before the First World War. So I thank you very much for your interest and your attention to this message. I've always found that kind of looking back at the history of how things have evolved is really important. I hope that you'll find this retrospective useful today. I've provided my email address there on the last page of the presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop me a line. I'd be happy to respond. And thanks very much for your interest today.